Good afternoon, students. Today is Monday, 5 April 2021. This will be our first lecture of the week. You can say that we're now in the home stretch of the semester. We've finished about 2/3 of the material. You've taken 2 of the 3 exams now. 1 more to go. The 3rd exam will be on the 11th of May, which is the date that I chose and put on the syllabus and the reading list. So 11 May. Please put it on your calendar and make sure nothing comes up that interferes with it. Okay, the exam will be on the 11th of May. There will be no makeup exam, so you need to make sure sometime between 8 o'clock in the morning and 8 o'clock in the evening on that day, you go in and take the exam. Another problem has come to light. It seems that some of you may be putting off watching the lectures until just before the exam. Now that's a big problem, because if anything comes up in the day or 2 before the exam that takes your time, you won't be able to sit and watch the lectures. Now this is not a problem when I'm teaching in the classroom, because the lectures are at a certain time and you have to be there to listen to me. So I've just discovered this is another downside of this internet technology. A particular student may be waiting until the day or 2 before the exam to watch, let's say, 4 or 5 hours worth of videos. And then if something comes up, if you don't feel well, you're not going to be able to take the time and watch all those videos. So you must not wait and stack up the videos, so to speak. Make sure you watch them close to the day in which I give the lectures. And while you're watching them, you should be pausing the video and making notes so that you can study your notes later, just before the exam. It's the same thing you should do in a classroom. When you're in the classroom listening to me lecture, you should be making notes. You won't be able to watch the lecture again. So you have nothing but your notes to fall back on for studying purposes. Okay, the exam stats have been posted, the statistics. They've been posted for a few days now on Canvas, so you can go in and look at them and see how the class as a whole did, Not that your grade in the course depends on how other people do, but I assume you are interested in how you did relative to the other students. Some of you did very well. Some of you did well. Some of you did so-so. Some of you did poorly. Some of you did very poorly. So there's a wide range of scores on the exam. I don't quite know what to make of that. All of you had access to the same exact material. All of you had access to my video lectures. You had access to the book. Remember, I've been posting chapters of the book on Canvas, so you have no excuse for not doing the reading. It's not as though the book is unavailable or that you can't afford it. It's been posted, each chapter, on Canvas for free. Also, any handouts that I post on Canvas are available to all of you. All of you have the same amount of time to study, to make notes. So the fact that some of you did very well and some of you did very poorly is puzzling to me. I frankly don't understand it. I suppose some of you don't much care what grade you get and don't put much effort into the course. Others care very much about the grade they get and do very well. Study hard, spend a lot of time making notes and studying. So by now, since 200 of the 300 points in the course have been nailed down, you can figure out what score you need on the 3rd exam in order to get a certain grade. It may be that an A is still possible for you, but it may mean that you need a score of 95 or something like that. Maybe your goal at this point is to get a B in the course. You can figure out how many points you need to get a B. Remember, I'm going to add up the 300. I'm going to add up your 3 exam scores at the end of the semester and divide the total by 3. I will then assign grades based on a 10% scale. So anybody with a score of 90 or higher, a final score, will get an A in the course. Anybody with a score in the 80s, anywhere in the 80s, will get a B, and so forth. So you can figure out what grade or what score you need on the third exam. It may be that for some of you, an A is no longer possible. And that's because even if you got 100 points on the third exam, you would still not reach the total of 270 that you need for an A. Okay, once again, the third exam is on the 11th of May. Get it on your calendar. Make sure nothing comes up to interfere with that, because all of you must take the exam on that day. In the course, to focus now on the material, we have covered 3 of the 5 normative ethical theories that we plan to discuss in the course. We've covered act utilitarianism. We spent a lot of time on that, didn't we? We have covered rule utilitarianism. We spent only a little bit of time on it, but we spent enough time to give you an idea of what that theory looks like. And then we spent a few days on a theory called egoism, or ethical egoism. We're about to turn to our 4th theory, which is called Kantianism, K-A-N-T-I-A-N-I-S-M, Kantianism. And when we finish that theory, several weeks from now, we will discuss a theory that I call Rossian pluralism. It's a theory developed by David Ross. So 3 theories down, 2 to go. Now there are a lot of other theories that we have not discussed and will not be discussing in this course, but these are the main theories that are discussed in most ethics books. We're going to spend 6 lectures on Immanuel Kant's theory called Kantianism, and then we'll spend 3 lectures on Ross's theory. Okay? So let's get started on Kant. I always like to tell you a little bit about these philosophers. I told you about Jeremy Bentham back when the course started. I told you about John Stuart Mill. There really was no prominent ethical egoist to tell you about. I did mention Ayn Rand, and along the way I mentioned Jesse Kalin and Edward Regis, mainly to show you that there really are ethical egoists. But Immanuel Kant, whose name gives the name of this theory, Kantianism, Kant was born in 1724 in a country called East Prussia. Not Russia, but Prussia. And it was East Prussia for his entire 80-year life. He died in 1804. He was almost 80 years old when he died. Kant was born and spent his whole life in a town called Königsberg. It starts with a K, Königsberg. Königsberg, during the Soviet era, was renamed. It was renamed Kaliningrad. And it's still known as Kaliningrad today. It's a seaport. It's a city on the Baltic Sea. And it's now part of Russia. So when Kant was born and lived there, it was part of East Prussia, but now it's part of Russia. Kant's language, the language he spoke and in which he wrote, was German. So some people call Kant a German philosopher, and I suppose that's close enough because that was his language. But I like to think he was a Prussian or East Prussian philosopher, not that it matters. Kant wrote a great many works of philosophy. He got a late start. He was a professor his whole life. His writing really took off when he was in his 30s and 40s. And for the rest of his life, he wrote voluminously. Books just poured out of him, one after another. And philosophers today are still reading and studying his writings because Kant was, and I think this is safe to say, Kant was a genius. Not every philosopher has been a genius. Not every philosopher today is a genius. Very few, in fact, are geniuses. But Kant was one of the certified geniuses. Others in that category are Aristotle, Leibniz, perhaps, maybe Bertrand Russell in the 20th century. Kant wrote on a great many topics, not just ethics, which is our focus, but he wrote in logic, he wrote about politics, he wrote about metaphysics, he wrote about epistemology, which is a fancy word for theory of knowledge. He wrote about the mind. He wrote about culture. He lectured on just about every topic at the university where he taught, the University of Königsberg. So he was a very well-rounded person, and he lectured many hours each day, far more than I lecture, for example, or really any contemporary philosopher. It's stunning, really, that he had any time to write, given how busy his lecture schedule was. One of the books that Kant wrote on ethics is a very thin book, very probably only this thick. It's entitled, and this is the German translation, the title is Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals. It came out in 1785 when Kant was 61 years old. So it's the work of a mature thinker, someone who's been around for a few decades and read a lot, thought a lot, discussed a lot, lectured a lot, and so on. This little book is very difficult, not only because Kant was a poor writer. Kant was I would say, a bad writer. He simply never developed a good style. And when you take into consideration the fact that English speakers like you and me who don't know who don't know German, now maybe you know German, I don't. But I'm assuming most of you don't know German. So if you want to read Kant, then either you need to learn German, which takes a long time, or you need a good translation of Kant's German writings into English. And as you probably know, translation itself is a very difficult task. And there's no such thing as a perfect translation. There are only better or worse translations. So to compound the problem of Kant's bad writing style, we have the fact that his writings have been translated from one language into another. And I think that partly explains why so many people today are still working on Kant's writings. Right? There are lots of different theories about what he meant and what he was up to, and so on. You could even describe it as an industry, a small industry of philosophers and others who are reading and writing about Kant, trying to make sense of him, because he's undoubtedly a genius, and what he has to say about ethics is very important. It's just that he said it in such a clumsy way that people are still debating about what he meant. Now, Kant, in many ways, revolutionized ethics. When you compare Kant with someone like David Hume, the difference is staggering. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher who lived between 1711 and 1776. So Hume was 13 years older than Kant, almost a generation older. And that means that when Kant was a student, he was reading the works of David Hume that had come over from Scotland. Now, Kant was indebted to Hume. In fact, he paid tribute to Hume later in his life for awakening him from his dogmatic slumber. Now, what that means is that Kant was sleeping and Hume woke him up. Now, he doesn't mean literally sleeping. What he means is intellectually, Kant was asleep. He wasn't seeing the real problems in philosophy until he read Hume, and Hume woke him up. And Kant, for the rest of his life, began to try to address Hume's concerns. Right? So he was always indebted to Hume, even if he ended up disagreeing with Hume. He was indebted to him for opening his eyes, for waking him up. Now, what in a nutshell is the difference between Hume and Kant? Well, their approaches to ethics are radically different. Hume held the view that reason, our human capacity to reason, is not the source of our values. What the source of our values, according to Hume, is our passion, our feelings, our emotions. So, in a very famous passage, Hume wrote the following. He said, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them." Think about it. Hume is saying that reason is the slave to the passions. What he means is that the passions, our passionate nature, gives us our goals or ends. It tells us the things that are important to us, that matter to us. The function of reason is to help us achieve those ends. So, passion supplies us with ends. Reason supplies us with means to those ends. Reason also plays a role in analyzing things. So, reason has two basic functions according to Hume. It helps us analyze things like justice. What is justice? What is liberty? What is fairness? Right? Reason can help us sort through those kinds of issues. And also, once we have marked out a particular end or goal, reason can help us determine what to do to achieve it. So Hume believed that reason is instrumental only. Reason is an instrument to help us achieve other things that we desire on other grounds. Now here comes Kant. Kant comes along and says, Hume doesn't understand reason. Reason can supply us with ends as well as means. For Kant, our reason, our rational capacity, can tell us what's good and bad and right and wrong. So Kant was a rationalist when it comes to ethics. Hume is what they call an empiricist when it comes to ethics. Okay, another way to put it is Kant believed that reason can do more than Hume thought that reason could do. So as we go along in Kant, you'll see that his emphasis is on the capacity of our rational capacity to determine what's right and wrong and what's good and bad. Whereas for Hume, reason can't do that. Okay, let me turn my page and we'll get into some of the details of Kant's theory. The first thing I want to do, as Feldman does in this chapter, which by the way has been posted on Canvas for several days now, I want to give you some examples that help you see just how different Kantianism is from utilitarianism. Remember, utilitarianism is a species of consequentialism. Do you remember that? Consequentialism is the view, just to repeat what I've said several times, consequentialism is the view that what makes an act right or wrong is nothing but its consequences. So if you want to determine what's right and what's wrong, you need to look at the consequences of the act that you're thinking of performing, as opposed to the consequences of alternative acts that you might perform. And the consequentialist says that right and wrong depends solely on that, solely on the consequences. So a consequentialist says nothing else matters as far as right and wrong go. The kind of act it is doesn't matter. Whether the act can be universalized doesn't matter. And I'll explain what that means as we go along. According to consequentialism, the motive with which you perform an act doesn't matter. Right? Remember our discussion of the doctor who went to another country to help the people there, and unbeknownst to her, she carried a disease to them, and it wiped out a large part of their community. What we said there is that to a utilitarian, she acted wrongly because she performed an act that had very bad consequences. Had she stayed home and performed that act, she would have performed an act that had much better consequences. And yet, her motive was good, wasn't it? She was well motivated. She was well intentioned. She was well meaning. So, to a consequentialist, the motive with which you perform an act is irrelevant to the rightness of the act. Now, Kant sees things differently. Kant is not a consequentialist. Kant disagrees with consequentialists when they say that only the consequences matter. In fact, for Kant, the consequences of the act play no role whatsoever in the rightness or wrongness of the act. None whatsoever. So isn't that interesting? On the one hand, we have consequentialism, which says only the consequences are relevant. And then on the other hand, we have Kantianism, which says consequences are irrelevant. They have no connection whatsoever to the rightness or wrongness of an act. Now, obviously, those are two extreme views, aren't they? Maybe somebody could try to find a hybrid, a kind of a middle ground right in here, where consequences are relevant to the rightness of an act, but so are other things. Okay, but Kantianism is not that middle ground. Kantianism is an extreme view. It says that what makes an act right or wrong is not the consequences of the act. So we can call Kant's theory a non-consequentialist theory. Okay, non-consequentialism. There's actually another name for non-consequentialism. It's not quite as long. Some philosophers call non-consequentialists deontologists. Let me spell that for you. It's D-E-O-N-T-O-L-O-G-Y. That's the word deontology. Okay, even though it's D-E, it's pronounced deon, not dion. Okay, deontology is a name that philosophers use to describe non-consequentialist theories. And so people who endorse these theories are called deontologists. Now the word deontology comes from the root deon, D-E-O-N, which means duty. So a deontologist is someone who believes in duties, someone who thinks that duty is the basic concept in ethics. Okay? Duty is the basic concept, and other concepts like right and good flow from it. So deontology is a duty-based system of ethics. And as you will see, that perfectly describes Kant's theory. Kant believed that duty is the primary and most fundamental concept of ethics. And Kant's goal was to set forth a moral principle or moral law that would tell us what our duties are. Right? There's a fundamental duty, and from it we can derive all kinds of subsidiary duties or particular duties. So Kant's goal was to describe what he called the supreme principle of morality, and it will give us a list of our duties. Okay, so now you know what deontology is. Literally, it means duty-based theory, and I've already told you that deontologists reject consequentialism. They reject the idea that consequences are the only things that matter in terms of right and wrong. Okay, so here's the basic question that a utilitarian asks. The utilitarian always asks, what will be the consequences of my doing a particular act? Let's call it Act A. If I perform Act A, what will that bring about? What will that cause to occur? What will the consequences of A be? And you must also compare the consequences of Act A with the consequences of other acts that you might perform, such as B and C. So by now you know that the utilitarian compares the consequences of all the acts that are currently available to you, and whichever act produces the best overall consequences is the right act. In fact, it's not just right, it's obligatory. And all the other acts that produce less good consequences are wrong or forbidden. So that should be familiar to you by now, because we spent a lot of time on act utilitarianism. So the act utilitarian always says, what would happen if I did this? What will happen if I do this? Here's the question the Kantian asks, and you'll see how it differs. Kant says, what would happen if everyone did what I'm about to do or what I'm thinking of doing? Not what will happen if I do this act, but what would happen if everyone did the act. Now, it's not likely that everyone is going to do the act, but you could imagine what would happen if everybody did it. Sometimes everybody doing a particular type of act will be a good thing. Sometimes everybody doing a particular type of act will be a bad thing. Here are some examples of bad things. Feldman's discussion is the tax cheat on page 97. Now, I'm not going to read it to you, but here's the gist of it. You can read it for yourself. Suppose you're thinking it's tax time, which in fact it is, right? The traditional tax due date is 15 April, which is only 10 days from now. I think that the IRS may have extended the deadline, but don't rely on what I'm telling you. I'm saying I think it's extended it, but traditionally it's been on the 15th of April. Anyway, suppose this tax deadline is approaching and you have calculated your taxes and you've determined that you owe the federal government, let's say, $200. $200, that's your tax bill for the year. And according to the law, you're required to pay that sum of money. Now, you might be wondering whether you morally ought to pay it. Not whether it's in your interest to pay it, but morally speaking. Here's how Kant would suggest you reason about it. Kant would say, what if everyone in your situation who owed taxes chose not to pay them? What if everyone who owed taxes, just as you do, were to decide not to pay them? That would produce a very bad state of affairs, because the government would not have resources to spend on things that you value, that everyone values: libraries, roads, road repairs, bridges, public education, food stamps, and all the other things that people want and need that are provided by the government. So Kant would say that when you ask the question, what would happen if everyone refrained from paying taxes, you would quickly realize that you could not want that state of affairs to exist. You wouldn't want it to exist. And therefore, it would be wrong for you not to pay your taxes. So for Kant, Kant wants to take you out of your own little world where all you're concerned about is your own interests, a kind of egoistic understanding. He wants to force you to think about the state of affairs where everyone performed the act that you were thinking of performing. And if you wouldn't want the state of affairs to exist where everyone did that type of act, then you shouldn't do it either. Kant did not want people to make exceptions for themselves. He thought that that was almost always wrong. You would almost always end up doing wrong when you made an exception for yourself. Now, you might, sitting there looking at your tax bill, you might say, I wish everyone else would pay his or her taxes except me. That way you have the benefit of the $200 to spend as you see fit, whereas everyone else is paying their taxes to the government. So the government stays funded, providing roads and bridges, libraries, public universities, and so on. Now, that may be your ideal world, but that's not the morally correct outcome. Kant says, you are no different from anybody else. You're not special, and you can't make exceptions for yourself. You have to think in universal terms. So for Kant, the question is always, and I do mean always, what would things look like if everyone did what I'm thinking of doing? And if that situation could not be willed or accepted by you, then it would be wrong for you to make an exception for yourself. All right, so that's the tax cheat case. Now, Feldman gives a lot of other examples of this. Let me just list a few. On page 98, Feldman mentions removing a pollution control device from your automobile. Now, maybe you would, when you buy a car, it has a pollution control device already installed because maybe the law requires it. Once you buy a car, you might want to take that device off, perhaps so that you can get better gas mileage, or maybe your car will run better or go faster. So you are tempted to take the pollution control device off your car. Should you do it? Right? Morally speaking, would it be right for you to do it? For Kant, that becomes the question, what if everyone took pollution control devices off their cars when they bought a new car? Presumably, they're there to keep pollution down. If everyone took them off, then our skies would be polluted and our breathing would be impaired. And you certainly wouldn't want that. You couldn't will a world like that. Therefore, you shouldn't take the pollution control device off your car. Why? Because you couldn't will and wouldn't want everyone to do so. Notice, Kant is forcing you to think in a certain way, not what will be the consequences of my doing this. That's the question a utilitarian asks. For Kant, it's what would be the case if everyone did it. A couple more examples. Suppose you refrain from giving to charity. So you're in a position to donate some money to a worthy cause to help people who are less fortunate than you, and you're wondering whether you ought to do so. Now, there are other uses for the money. Maybe you'd like a new stereo or something that would please you. Kant would say, what if everyone refrained from giving to charity? Could you will a world like that? Well, you would be willing a world where the poor suffer even more than they currently are, because resources that would come to them through charity are no longer coming to them, right? So again, since you cannot will that everyone refrain from giving to charity, you should not refrain from giving to charity. That means you should get out your checkbook and write the check instead of buying the stereo. All right, what about telling a lie in order to get out of a bad spot? Suppose you're in a position where lying will get you out of a tough situation, a bad spot. Should you lie? Well, again, the question Kant would have you ask is, what if everyone in a situation like this told a lie? Everyone, literally everyone. Well, wouldn't that have the effect of making people's word less trustworthy? If everyone lied whenever they were in a tough spot, a bad spot, then lying would be the routine thing to do. And because we live in a world where people routinely lie, no one would believe what anyone says. No one would trust anyone to tell the truth. Would you want to live in a world like that where people routinely lied to one another? I wouldn't. So Kant thinks that because you can't will a world like that, you shouldn't tell the lie either. As you'll see as we go along, Kant believed that it's always wrong to lie. Always. I mean that. Always. Even what we call little white lies. Little white lies are what? Lies that are designed to avoid hurting people's feelings. Lies that don't really matter because not much is at stake. I can tell you that Kant never married and never had any children. He lived 80 years as a bachelor. He did have a servant, a man named Martin Lamp, who served him for several decades and helped him run his household. But Kant himself had no family. And maybe you can understand why. If Kant had a wife and his wife came out into the room where he was and said, I have my new dress on, Emmanuel, or Manny, maybe he went by Manny, I doubt it. Manny, I'm wearing my new dress. Does it make me look fat? Kant would say, you mustn't lie. You have to tell her the truth. And that, of course, would cause some bad feelings and maybe end in a divorce. Sometimes you can, most of us think that telling the truth is not always required and maybe even sometimes wrong. But Kant would have none of it. Kant believed you must never lie no matter what. That doesn't mean you always have to tell everybody everything, but if somebody asks you a question point blank and you answer at all, you must tell the truth. You can't lie. So Kant had very strong views about lying. Don't make exceptions for yourself here or in any other area. What about, here's an example Feldman gives on page 98. What if you're on campus one day and you're in a hurry to get to class? Instead of following the sidewalks, which may take a roundabout course to the building you're going toward, you cut straight across, right? They say the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, so you aim yourself directly toward the door of the building you're going to, and you cut right across the grass, even though the grass has just recently been planted, right? New grass seed. Is it wrong for you to cut across the grass like that? Well, a utilitarian might say, if it's just you, it won't have any long-term effect on the grass. You'll save some time, you'll get to class on time, and you won't really be harming the grass. So a utilitarian might tell you, cut across the grass, even though it means some minor damage. Kant would look at it differently. Kant would ask the following question: what if everyone who's in a hurry cut across the grass and walked on it? Could you will that? Would you want that? And the answer, Kant would say, is no. Because if everyone took the most direct route from point A to point B, then there would be ugly, unsightly paths worn into the grass, and maybe they will turn muddy in the future. The dirt will turn to mud when it rains, and it'll be unsightly at a minimum. And since you can't will that, then you shouldn't make an exception for yourself and cut across the grass. So I've given several examples now simply to illustrate the point that Kant is making. Don't look at it from your narrow point of view and say, what will happen if I do this? Ask a broader, more meaningful question. What if everyone did it? Would I want that? Yes or no? If the answer is no, then you shouldn't do it either. That's the gist of the Kantian position. And I hope now you can see it's radically different from the utilitarian or consequentialist point of view. It's not all about consequences. In fact, it's not about consequences at all. It's about imagining a world where everyone acted in a certain way and asking, would I want to live in that world? Yes or no? Could there be such a world? Yes or no? Now, Kant is searching throughout his books on ethics. He's searching for what he calls the supreme principle of morality. And that's a quotation from Feldman on page 99. Kant says, and by the way, this is Kant's actual words translated into English. Kant says, I'm looking for the supreme principle of morality. In our terms, we could say he's looking for the true and correct normative ethical theory, one that competes with utilitarianism, for example. Feldman calls this principle Kant's main principle. That's also on page 99. So let's turn to the section entitled Maxims. Maxims. And that's all we're going to cover the rest of today. When we meet again for the second of 4 lectures on this chapter, we will pick up with the section entitled Universal Law. Okay, so in fact, let me tell you the sections we're covering next time. We're going to cover universal law, and we're going to cover willing, and we're going to cover the categorical imperative. So next time we meet, later this week, we're going to cover 3 sections. Make sure you've read them before you turn the video on. Okay? Once again, universal law, willing, and the categorical imperative. So for the rest of today, I want to just cover the section entitled Maxims. I want to make sure by the end of today that you understand what a Kantian maxim is and how they function. Okay, let me first define a maxim. According to Kant, a maxim, and I'm spelling this M-A-X-I-M. It's a word you've probably seen, maybe even have used it. It's a word that Kant liked. He used it very often. A maxim, according to Kant, is, quote, a subjective principle of volition, unquote. And that's quoted from Feldman on page 99. A subjective principle of volition. Now, volition is just a fancy word for the will. So a maxim is a principle of the will, and it's specifically subjective. Now, what usually contrasts with the word subjective? Answer, objective. So when Kant calls a maxim a subjective principle of volition, he means to contrast it with an objective principle of volition. And I'll explain why it's subjective in just a few minutes, so bear with me. I want to make sure I take it little step by little step. A maxim, according to Kant, can be thought of as how you understand what you're doing. It's what you, the agent, takes yourself to be doing while you're performing an act. It's kind of like an act of self-legislation where you are making a law for yourself, right? You're deciding what to do. And when you decide what to do, you're basing it on what the situation is that you find yourself in and what your objectives are. So here's an example. This is from Feldman, page 99. Listen carefully. Here's an example of a maxim. Quote, whenever I need money and can get it by borrowing it, then I will borrow it, even if I know I won't be able to repay it. Unquote. Now, let's break that down because there's a lot packed in there. First of all, a maxim states the situation that you take yourself to be in or that you think you're in. In this case, whenever I need money and can get it by borrowing it. Okay? The agent in this example believes that he or she needs money and can get it by borrowing it. So that's the first part. You are in a situation, or you think you're in a certain situation. The next part of the maxim spells out a particular act. In this case, I will borrow it, even if I know I won't be able to repay it. So when you put it all together, that's the person's maxim. It describes a situation that you think you're in, and then it prescribes an action for that situation. So Feldman describes a maxim as follows. He says a maxim, quote, must describe some general sort of situation and then propose some form of action for the situation, unquote. Now, go back to rule utilitarianism for a moment. Do you remember that elaborate flowchart that I had that was colorful? It's been posted on Canvas. It's still up if you want to go back and look at it. It set forth a number of terms that are used by the rule utilitarian, terms like correct, the correct rule, conformance utility, an alternative to a rule, and so on. All those terms were interconnected according to the theory that we call rule utilitarianism. Let's focus on one part of that diagram, the term rule. You remember what a rule is? A rule is a conditional or a conditional sentence, which means if then. So a rule has the form if blank, then blank. The first blank is filled in with a description of a situation. Okay? For example, if I have made a promise, then blank. The second blank is filled in with a prescription of an action. So here would be a possible rule. If you have made a promise, then keep it. Here's an alternative rule. If you have made a promise, then break it. Another one. If you have made a promise, then do whatever you feel like doing. Okay, so that's just a quick review. When we discussed rule utilitarianism, we introduced the concept of a rule. Well, a maxim is very similar, isn't it? A maxim also has the form if blank, then blank. So if you want, if it helps you, you can think of a Kantian maxim like a rule, right? If I'm in a certain situation, then I shall do X, perform act X. Now, Feldman says, based upon his reading of Kant, every action has a maxim. Every one. Now, don't confuse an action with a bodily movement. If you're sleeping at night, you're going to be rolling around and moving. Your body will be moving, but those aren't actions. Okay? Those are bodily movements. An action is a bodily movement plus something else, some kind of act of will or intention. Right? You've got to be conscious in order to perform an act. And more than conscious, you've got to will that you move your body in a certain way. So let's focus only on actions, not just bodily movements. Okay? According to Feldman, every action has a maxim, whether you know what it is or not. Okay? Let me say that again. Every action has a maxim, whether you're aware of it or not, whether you know what it is or not. Usually, when we act, we do so spontaneously, right? We don't sit around and think about it. A lot of the things we do are kind of automatic. But that doesn't mean they don't have a maxim. They do. It's just that the maxim isn't brought to consciousness, right? It's implicit. It's hidden away. If I ask you when you do something, if I say to you, hold on a second, I saw you just now open the door of the dishwasher. Could you tell me what's going on? And you would say, oh, sure, I'm about to put some dirty dishes into the dishwasher. So you're stating your maxim. Whenever I have eaten my food and have created dirty dishes, I shall open the dishwasher and put them in it. Right? So the maxim wasn't before your mind when you acted, but it's still there in a sense. And if I were to ask you what you did, you would tell me your maxim, wouldn't you? Right? We can always, when we think about it, explain why we're doing things, what our goals are, and so on. That's what a maxim is. Another, Feldman's example, by the way, on page 100 is taking a test. If I were to ask you what you're doing, you'd say, oh, I'm taking a test. Right? That would state the maxim of your exam. Whenever I'm in an exam situation, I shall be quiet and answer the questions as best I can so that I can get a good grade on the exam. So every action has a maxim, according to Kant. Now, let's go back to that word subjective. Remember that? Kant says that a maxim is a subjective principle of volition, not objective. And now we can see what he means by that. A maxim is subjective because it states the situation you take yourself to be in, even if you're not really in that situation. After all, we can be mistaken about things, and we want to allow for that. Now, Feldman's example of this goes back to the savings account case. What if I What if I believe incorrectly that I've emptied my savings account? People are forgetful. Maybe one day when my mind was occupied, I went to the bank and I withdrew the final $100 that I had in my savings account. Okay? Or how about this? Suppose I decided I want to go to the bank and withdraw my last $100. On the way to the bank that day to withdraw my final $100, I meet an old friend. And we get engrossed in conversation, catching up with the old news and so on. And before I know it, we're off to have lunch somewhere. And even though my goal was to go to the bank and withdraw my final $100, I never got there. Now, fast forward a month. Now I find myself needing some money. And I think immediately about the money I had in the bank. And I say to myself, oh, I withdrew that money. A month ago, I withdrew the money. In other words, you make a mistake. You think you withdrew the money, but in fact you didn't, and it's still there in the bank account. Now, suppose you need money. You say to yourself, whenever I need money and can get it by borrowing it, then I will borrow it, even though I know I won't be able to repay it. That's the example we discussed earlier. You think that you're broke, but in fact you're not broke. You're just forgetful. So what is your maxim? Your maxim is whenever I need money, i.e. whenever I'm broke and can get it by borrowing it, even though I know I'll never be able to repay it, I shall do so. Okay? So subjectively speaking, you think you're in that situation where you have no money. And that's what matters as far as the maxim is concerned. A maxim is subjective. It describes the situation you think you're in, even if it's not the situation you're actually in. Okay? And one more thing about maxims. Two people performing the same action can have a different maxim. And here's the example Feldman gives. It's of two grocers. One of them Feldman calls Grimbley, and one of them he calls Hughes. Grimbley and Hughes. Okay, he discusses this case on page 100. Now, Grimbley is self-interested. He's a merchant. He owns a shop, and he has decided that he will make the greatest profit over time if he always treats his customers well. And that includes giving his customers correct change. So Grimbley's maxim is something like this. Whenever I can earn a higher profit by giving customers correct change, I shall do so. Hughes has a different maxim. Hughes's maxim has nothing to do with making a profit. Hughes thinks that you ought to give your customers correct change, whether it furthers your own interests or not. So Hughes has the following maxim. Whenever I can give my customers the correct change and do right by them, I shall do so. Notice it makes no reference to increasing profits or doing well for yourself. Grimbley and Hughes always end up giving their customers the correct change. If you were to observe Grimbley and Hughes day after day after day, what you would discover is that Grimbley always gives his customers the correct change. He never shorts them. Hughes, same thing. Hughes always gives his customers the correct change. So their actions are the same. But notice, what's going on in their head subjectively is different. Grimbley is self-interested, and he has decided that giving correct change is in his long-term rational self-interest. The customers will leave happy. They will tell their friends about the good service and the good prices, and they'll all come back again and again. And Grimbley will do well for himself. So for Grimbley, giving the correct change is part of a good long-term, self-interested business practice. Hughes gives correct change with no thought to whether it benefits him in the long run. That never crosses his mind. He just mindlessly gives correct change because he believes it's the right thing to do. So here we have an example of two grocers who perform the same act, namely giving correct change, but they do it with different maxims. And that's what Kant means when he says the maxim is subjective. It's what's going on in your head while you're acting. It explains the nature of the act you're performing and your motivation for performing that act. Now, here's maybe a more mundane example for you. Take the act of holding a door open for somebody. Have you ever walked through a door? I know you have. You walk through a door, and as you pull the door open and start to go through, you notice someone is coming up behind you, coming into the building behind you. Typically, you will hold the door open, won't you, for that person? Now, aren't there many different door opening maxims? Let's call it a door opening maxim. I might suppose my door opening maxim is hold the door open for anyone who happens to be behind me as I go through it. Okay? That could be my door opening maxim. Here's another one. Whenever I'm going through a door, I shall hold the door open for women. Okay? That's a possible door opening maxim. And you can call it sexist if you want. I don't care. It's not important. But it's a different maxim, isn't it? Holding a door open for women specifically and not for men is a possible door opening maxim. Right? Many men were raised to do that, to hold doors open for women, and not always for men. There are many people who object to that today, as you know. Right? People say, I don't appreciate a man holding a door open for me because I'm a woman. Now notice, if you observe someone on a regular basis over a period of time, you might discover that that person holds the door open for everyone. And from that, you can infer that person's door opening maxim. You might come to the conclusion that that person has the maxim, whenever I'm going through a door, I shall hold it open for anyone, male or female, old or young, black or white, who happens to be behind me. What if, when you observe someone, you notice over time that the person routinely holds the door open for women, but not for men? You may infer from that the person's door opening maxim is something like, whenever I go through a door and there's a woman behind me, I shall hold the door open for her. Again, you might call that a sexist door opening principle, but that's not the issue. It's a different maxim. Now, I confess there have been times in my life when I am going through a door and I notice someone behind me as I'm going through the door, and it happens to be a woman, and I hold the door open for her, and I almost want to say to her as she goes through the door, excuse me, I hope you don't think I held that door open for you just because you're a woman. I assure you I would have held it open for a man in the same situation. But that would be overkill. And I haven't actually done that, although I've wanted to many times. I don't want a woman to think that I'm holding a door open for her because she's a woman. Right? But if a woman takes advantage of my door opening, she might think that I have a sexist door opening principle or maxim. And I don't want her to think that. But I don't know what else to do about it other than to stop her and explain it. And by that point, she'd be really annoyed, wouldn't she? Okay, you're wasting my time. I don't really care what your door opening maxim is. Thank you for holding the door open. Whether you're a sexist or not, I guess, is not that important. Okay, the final thought is this. We have been discussing maxims, and we've been discussing specific maxims. For example, my door opening maxim. we can always generalize our maxims. So here's an example. Whenever I am tired, I shall sleep. Okay, that could be my sleep maxim. Whenever I am tired, I, Keith, whenever I am tired, I shall sleep. How would you generalize that maxim? Well, you generalize it by making it applicable to anyone, not just yourself. So here would be the generalized form of my sleep maxim. Here's Feldman on 101. Whenever anyone is tired, he will sleep, or he or she will sleep. So, once again, I'm going to move from a maxim to a generalized maxim, or a generalized form of a maxim. Okay, maxim, whenever I'm tired, I shall sleep. Generalized form, whenever anyone is tired, he or she shall sleep. We are now in a position to move on to the next section or two, because Kant is going to tell us that what makes an act right or wrong has to do with some feature of the generalized form of your maxim. Not your maxim, but the generalized form. So what we're going to do is, in order to follow Kant's theory, you're going to have to start off by asking, what is my maxim? You're then going to generalize it, and then you're going to ask certain questions about it to determine whether your act is right or wrong. And that's why I had to introduce this generalized form of the maxim, because it's a bridge between the maxim and determining whether your act is right or wrong. Okay, we're just over an hour in. I think that's enough for today. I've introduced you to Kant, the person, told you a few things about him. He was a very interesting person. And maybe I'll share some other tidbits along the way. For example, Kant, in his 80 years of life, never went more than 40 miles from his birthplace. Okay, I don't know where Kant was born. Suppose he was born in a particular house in Königsberg. He never went more than 40 miles from that house in 80 years. Think about it. He never traveled. And here's the real kicker, the irony. Kant was at one time the world's foremost authority on geography. I kid you not. He taught geography. He was expert in it. He wrote about it. The man had never seen a mountain firsthand. He'd read about mountains and he'd seen drawings of mountains, but he never saw one with his own eyes. He lived in the seaport of Königsberg his whole life and never traveled. Amazing. So that's just a little bit of biographical information. I'll share some more as we go. So we've covered the introductory material. When we meet again on our second lecture this week, we'll take up the topics of universal law and willing. We need to ask, what does it mean to will something? And finally, we'll start looking at Kant's supreme principle of morality, and he gave it a special name. Kant called it the categorical imperative. So we have a lot to do in our next lecture this week. It'll probably be on Wednesday. Okay, I have something to do on Thursday, so I probably won't do any lecturing. So for this class, ethics, today is Monday, probably Wednesday. Almost certainly we'll do our second lecture on Wednesday. But anyway, I always send an email once they're posted. So just wait for the email and then you can go watch it. Have a great day. Enjoy the championship basketball game tonight if you're interested in that. And it's Rangers opening day down at the ballpark. I guess they're going to get started in a couple of hours. And so a big day for sports fans. And I'll see you in a couple of days.